Welcome to Sharpe Insights, conversations with your plan giving experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Grant Miller. These days, you may be asking yourselves, as fundraisers, how do we respond to economic uncertainty, the current political environment, and other challenges? Today I'm joined by Barlow, Mann, Sharpe Group's General Counsel.
Grant, it's great to be with you and Julie today, and I hope some of the ideas that we discuss will be of importance to the audience that you have today.
Thanks, Barlow. I'm also here with Julie Schuldner, one of Sharpe's senior consultants.
Hi, Grant. Hi, Barlow. Excited to be with you all today.
Thanks, Julie. Today we're going to explore how nonprofits can navigate current and future uncertainty without losing momentum. We'll discuss donor behavior during past turbulent times, how to communicate legacy giving sensitively, and strategies for long-term success. Julie, let's start with you. In what ways do uncertain or volatile political and economic climates affect donor behavior? And what specific challenges do they present for plan giving teams?
So, Grant, that's a great question to start off our conversation this afternoon. We know that in general, donors have personal concerns that they need to address, whether it's providing for their heirs, concerns about running out of money, how they're going to maybe address their healthcare needs moving forward. But I think the uncertainty regarding the economy and the volatile political climate present a whole new set of challenges for donors and also for our nonprofits, of course. So I think it's important to acknowledge the concerns while, of course, staying focused on the donor's desire to support your mission. And I think one suggestion I would have is to focus on some of the deferred gifts, a bequest, a beneficiary designation, gifts that don't require the donor to give anything now. And then maybe when they're more comfortable, they can pursue a blended gift with the addition of a qualified charitable distribution along with the beneficiary designation. I think also a gift from a donor advised fund could be considered since those funds have already been committed as a charitable gift. So I would say just to stay focused on the mission and understand that some people have challenges, but some don't. And so it's just important to be able to cultivate those relationships with your donors.
Thanks, Julie. You mentioned that a lot of people find themselves in very different situations when approaching their plan giving. And a lot of people also have varying responses emotionally or economically or otherwise to things that might be going on in the world. How can plan giving programs communicate the importance of these planned gifts without sounding either gloomy, dreadful, opportunistic, or anything in between?
I'll try that one. And it's funny, as you were asking the question, I was reminded about one of my peers many years ago, another lawyer in the planned giving world, Alan Cates. And he was also worked with the University of Tennessee in their planned giving program. And his wife referred to him as Dr. Death because he was always dealing with people and their estate plans. Well, it need not be that way. And the funny thing about the constituents that you'll be talking with, typically they're long-term older donors that are very, very close to the organization. They may or may not have been large contributors or major contributors, but their commitment over time and their willingness to communicate with you and be a donor through thick and thin is usually proven. They've been giving long enough where they may have given in prior years where there was a recession. And they know really the work that you do, and they're very committed to your mission. So it's not like a cold call. And it's a natural transition as times are changing to talk to these friends who are almost like family members and make suggestions that might help them consider a gift that they'd like to make, but maybe had never considered. We don't have to have all the answers, but we need to be willing to reach the right people at the right time in their lives. Give them a few ideas and then see if they have any questions. If they require more information, you can provide that or find somebody that has the information that they would like to know more about, whether it's a donor advised fund or IRA QCD or a simple estate planning question. You don't necessarily want to be practicing law, even if you're an attorney with a donor, but you certainly have the ability to point them in the right direction. And even if gift is not forthcoming immediately, you may have planted the seed. Oftentimes, a planned gift, it's not a snap decision. It's something that it may take months or even years for them to decide what ultimately they'd like to do. I hope that helps. Grant and Julie, if you have any thoughts, feel free to add them as well.
Julie, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that we certainly never want to sound gloomy or opportunistic or anything in between. We need to focus on the future, focus on the mission. Not everybody's affected by what's going on in the environment in terms of the political or economic environment. And again, a lot of these gifts are future gifts. And so these donors, again, you've got long-term relationships with them. They're invested in your mission and your organization. They want to continue to support and they want to sustain your mission for the future. And so we always want to be positive and communicate to the donor that the investment that they're making in your organization is something that's of value to them. And then, of course, to the people who your mission supports.
Thanks, Julie. Piggybacking on that, I think that most nonprofit organizations are organizations of resilience and hope. And the things that any organization is trying to do in the world, they're trying to do for good or for all kinds of different reasons that the organization and their donors find meaningful to them. So how can planned gifts be framed as an act of resilience or an act of hope?
I'm reminded of the Great Depression. I was a history major, and so sometimes you look back at the past to see what's going on in the future and see whether there are any common factors. And during the Great Depression, times were hard. People were lined up in unemployment lines. They were losing their mortgages. Farms were being foreclosed on. Very, very difficult times. And during that time, there was a kind of an uplifting song that was the anthem to the Great Depression. And it was, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" And during the Great Depression, one of the great industrialists and at the time the richest person in America began to carry a bag of dimes with him. And he would routinely give these dimes to children, adults, anyone that he met, a shiny dime. And the concept was that just about anybody, if they were still working, their farm hadn't or business hadn't been foreclosed on, they could spare a dime. And it was during that period when FDR was the president who had polio. And he was very supportive of trying to find a cure for polio. And for his birthday, somebody suggested, just mail a dime in. It was a gift anybody could make. So that's something, it's almost 100 years ago, but it's still relevant today. Stay very close to your donors. Make sure they know every gift, regardless of size, is appreciated. As I mentioned earlier, oftentimes many planned giving donors are just regular, ordinary donors that happen late in life to decide to include a favorite charity or two or three in their estate plans. So they probably, if they're of a certain generation, their parents or grandparents told them about the Great Depression. And it's funny, we haven't had another depression since the Great Depression. We had a Great Recession. Now, Grant, I don't know how great that recession was. I didn't enjoy it very much, but it wasn't as bad as the Great Depression from the 20s and 30s. So that's an act people can participate in, whether the gift is large or small. And speaking of large gifts, Warren Buffett arranged over a $6 billion gift to 5 foundations that he's been supporting. So the gifts can be large or small. It's based on the donor's capacity. And he's already given away $60 billion since joining the group, The Pledge. And that's certainly, his gifts are interesting because they're going to foundations, and those dollars may provide a flow of funds through future tough times.
Barlow, I think
Yeah,
that's such an important message. The fact that anybody needs to be able to see themselves as a donor and understand that a gift of any amount can have a huge impact. And nonprofits, really, by the very nature of why they exist, are about resilience and hope. And I think that just communicating the message that everybody can make an impact by sharing what the impact is that gifts make on your organization. So share those donor stories of all shapes and sizes, not just the $1 million gift, but the $100 gifts, the $10,000 gifts. As we put them together, they have a huge impact on the organization. And so share those statistics with your donors so that they can see how they can be a part of your success and your sustainability.
that's a really good point. I think one of the things that I'm always trying to communicate in the publications that I write is that you don't always have to leave a $1 million bequest to be effective or to show resilience and hope and make the changes that are meaningful to you. Barlow, you mentioned the Great Depression, and then you mentioned the economic recession of 2008, which maybe wasn't great, but it also wasn't that great. Some other things that have happened that I can remember are Black Monday, 9/11, COVID. What are some common misconceptions that resurface among plan giving organizations, among donors, that will resurface during these times of unrest and uncertainty? And how should plan giving teams respond?
That's a great question because each one of those things, whether it was the stock market crash of Black Monday, whether it was a terrorist attack of 9/11 or COVID, which was a global catastrophe and killed millions of people, even though they're different, the response is sometimes the same. When we're faced with a tremendous calamity, sometimes it results in paralysis on the part not just of donors, but on the part of staff. And it's during these hard times you have to decide to go ahead and take steps to tell your mission, how you're affected, and how important your donors' support continues to be. And amazingly, for example, during COVID, the global pandemic officially began in 2020. That was a record year for philanthropy. Tremendous amount of gifts flowed in. Now, meanwhile, as the pandemic extended and lasted longer and people were isolated, people weren't going to their offices. There were breaks in marketing. Maybe the donor channels were not as active as they should have been because we had to reinvent a way to do our jobs. And there was actually a dip later during the global pandemic. And donors have continued to respond, even though giving has not kept up with inflation in recent years until this year. We find that donors are still giving generously, even though fewer households are participating in philanthropic activity. Actually, it just may be partially underreported. Some of the younger generations, for example, are volunteering their time. And I'm reminded of the saying about you can give your time, your talent, or your treasure. And many of the young people that have entered the job market, they don't have a lot of excess treasure, but they do have some time. And you may bring them in first as a volunteer, and then who knows what will happen later. And they may attract others to support you as well.
I would also add, Barlow and Grant, that I think it's during these times of unrest and challenges that people most need a human connection. And so while you may not be directly soliciting during times that people may be faced with challenges, it's a great time to just reach out to your donors and your constituents and just see how they're doing. Just have a conversation. I remember back in 2020, before I came to Sharpe, I was working at a continuing care retirement community, and there was so much isolation and people were really just very scared. And we just got on the phone and just called people and just reached out and had those conversations and continued to cultivate those relationships, not only as plan giving officers, but just as humans. And so there's definitely other tasks that may take priority during times of unrest, if you will.
I also understand that during COVID and other times of unrest and such, people will have a tendency to maybe look internally and look at their situations, and you'll have more people looking into estate planning and their own estate plans. Is there any advice that you would give plan giving teams during these times that would encourage people to think about their estate plans?
I continue to just be surprised at how few people have estate plans. I think the numbers hovers around 40%. And I think that COVID saw a lot of people take more of an interest in their future, in the future of their estate, the future of their health care, all of those things that go into that estate plan. I think that educating your donors, don't assume that they all have a will, they have a trust, they have a plan, but just educating them. You can do it through publications, brochures, booklets that you send to them. You can have information on your website. You can have articles in your newsletter, just communicating how to go about having an estate plan, what to do, what's important, how often it should be updated. And so again, just not assuming that because you might have people with other experience, other expertise, other knowledge that they know about plan giving and estate planning. So just that general education in addition to reaching out with your asks.
Well, estate planning is certainly important, and nationally, the number of people that have a will or other basic estate planning document has shrunk through the years. Yet estate planning has gotten slightly more complicated. Instead of a will, people are using living trusts. They're using beneficiary designations. They don't coordinate those plans. They can have some very unpleasant things happen. Fortunately, it can happen even if they have competent legal and financial advisors, and that their circumstances can change over time. Their household wealth could increase as a result of an inheritance. They could have hit a home run in the stock market or when buying a lottery ticket. Any number of things can suddenly change what had been the right estate plan into something that's simply not going to work. So it's important not only to have a plan, but make sure that it's reviewed and updated periodically. The will that is the right will or estate plan for a 40-year-old might not be appropriate 40 years later when you're 80 years old. If you've kept that same will, your beneficiary designations, you might have problems if your family circumstances have changed and perhaps you have a different spouse, and yet all the documents are referring to the prior spouse. That could be problematic for the survivor who may end up thinking, what was really going on with my relationship with this person? Many things can change. So it's important to review and update one's plans. And that includes the charitable list. Don't believe just because someone had you in their first will that you'll be in the last will. And much of the research shows that the last will, the operative will or trust, oftentimes the prior estate plan had no charitable provisions. So stay close, particularly to the older generations, and recognize stage of life issues as you're dealing with younger people who may also want to include you in their plans via maybe a beneficiary designation on a retirement plan or a life insurance policy. That could be a starter gift. They're holding their hand up to say they're very interested in the work you do.
Thanks, Barlow. And just to pivot a little bit, we know that there are things that happen that are unprecedented, unexpected, catastrophic, etc. But there are also things that happen that we might be able to anticipate. I know that the government, for example, in legislation generally runs like a well-oiled machine. But I know that there are circumstances where legislation might be stalled due to issues in Congress or the Senate and other bodies. But how do plan giving teams develop strategies, navigate, stay ahead of the curve amidst changing policies, changing administrations, changing tax laws, and those other issues?
It's certainly a mistake to overemphasize the tax incentives of giving, but it's also a mistake to underemphasize. So it's a matter of balance. When I was in law school, the maximum income tax rate was nearly twice what it is today. The estate tax had reached the point where the middle class was being subject to a federal estate tax. Now people are largely finding that they have no federal and no state inheritance or estate taxes. And so if you're talking about saving taxes when you arrange a gift through your will, you're dealing with less right now and less than 1% of the people who die each year. Similarly, the much larger standard deduction means that very few people itemize. Traditionally, we had about 25 to 35% of taxpayers each year itemize their deductions. Now, did they make the gift in order to get a charitable deduction? Not really. It was more like a manufacturer's rebate from the federal government. If you did something that they provided an incentive for and you put that on your tax return as an itemized deduction, you lowered your tax bill the following April 15th. People rarely make gifts because of a deduction. It may affect the size and property given and the timing of the gift. There have been surveys in the past where they rank things like the importance of tax incentives. It's not the number one, number two, or number three. It's way down on the list of what is motivating the gift. The Warren Buffett $6 billion gift. There's no way on earth he would ever be able to deduct all of the deduction, even with a 5-year carry forward. So he's giving in spite of taxes instead of because of taxes.
I think sometimes it's intimidating when you hear about these billionaires and they're giving. Warren Buffett, Mackenzie Scott, thinking, well, I can't do that. They've got so much money to give away and it's so complex. And I think it's a challenge for plan giving teams to understand and stay ahead of the changing the policies and the tax laws. And I think it's important to rely on the experts. You're here listening to Sharpe Group consultants today and hearing from them what's going on in the environment. Go to training. We offer lots of trainings, and it's important to take advantage of that so you're up to date. You need that current information. And I think that most often in our seminars, that's the feedback that we get, especially from some of these newer gift officers. They're just apprehensive about having conversations with donors because they don't want to be faced with questions that they don't know the answers to. So try and stay ahead of that. And there's subscriptions out there where you can stay abreast of what's going on from DC and even from Sharpe Group.
Thanks, Julie. When I was growing up, I watched Mr. Rogers quite a bit. I don't know if you all did.
Oh, yeah.
But I used to, have an anecdote where he said that when he was a boy and he would see scary things in the news, his mom would always say, look for the helpers. You always find people who are helping. And I'm just curious, and Julie, we can start with you, but can you share any success stories where plan giving revenues have had a lasting impact during these turbulent times? And if there's anything to learn from that idea of looking for the helpers or the really good things that can come out of these other times of darkness and uncertainty and seeming chaos and such.
Yeah, of course. I have a client that I've worked with, very, very small organization. They've got 3 part-time employees, and just to put things into context, their executive director makes about $17 an hour. So they've got about $125,000 in their annual budget. They received a $50,000 bequest last year. I mean, that has a massive impact on their budget and what they can do and the stress it takes off them. And the message really there is just to continue to communicate about the impact that a bequest can have, especially during turbulent times. People are still recovering from COVID. It's been 5 years, but organizations are still having a rough time. And so I think about if this bequest that they received was just a fluke. They have not really pushed bequest giving as an organization. And I think about if they had, they would be seeing more come in because they've been around for 70 years. And so I think just making sure that you're still talking about plan giving to your donors, now is the time to talk about it because there are so many different ways to give either now or in the future.
Julie, that's a great point. And again, whether it's a relatively small bequest, the small bequest can have a huge impact. Also, curiously enough, many of those bequests, particularly you said that was a $50,000 bequest,
Yeah.
those cash bequests, when the estate's settled, you typically receive those very quickly. So during times like this, where some fundraising channels are a little slower than usual, having a regular stream of smaller bequests, $10,000, $25,000, $50,000 can provide critical revenue when you're experiencing tight funds from other sources. Meanwhile, when the larger estate gifts come in, many charities, even if those funds are unrestricted, will put it into a quasi-endowment or permanent endowment. Many of America's colleges and universities that are hundreds of years old, their endowments, a critical source of endowment to those institutions were from estate gifts. John Harvard left his library and cash to establish Harvard University. Benjamin Franklin established 2 charitable trusts in his estate plans, and they were going to support charities, but the trust would terminate after 200 years. And so that was remarkable. And look at the time that they were established, shortly after the country was founded. And he was making a gift looking 200 years into the future.
Yeah, Barlow, I know that plan giving professionals understand the importance of an endowment because it certainly ensures more long-term sustainability. I feel sometimes, though, it's the board that presents the biggest challenge to an endowment because they feel like they'd rather utilize the money that's been being given for some sort of capital improvement. What do you think in your experience? Do you agree that boards sometimes don't understand the purpose of endowment?
Well, there's a saying about the board. You want them to make decisions or get out of the way. And sometimes they're going to make very good decisions and sometimes not so much. But if your board is heavily made up by people who are not only enjoying being on the board, but they're also enjoying supporting you, oftentimes the plan giving program will develop a relationship with one or more board members to help the rest of the board understand that some gifts should be spent immediately, some gifts may be spent over time, and some gifts are better suited to create sustainability by, in effect, having a rainy day fund. But I've seen everything. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Again, the best thing, if you can have the ear of 1 or 2 people on the executive or finance committee, they can have, nobody necessarily wants to hear the plan giving officer tell the board what to do.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. I like that idea, though, of having a liaison between the board and your plan giving department.
That definitely seems like a good strategy. Barlow, you mentioned the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the concept of a rainy day fund. There are many events and circumstances that we can anticipate and many that we can't. I think there are obviously some catastrophic situations that come out of nowhere. For example, some political situations that we can brace ourselves for in many ways. What are some strategies that plan giving professionals can adopt now just to ensure long-term sustainability and success in the face of all of this, considering none of us have a crystal ball. We don't ever know what's coming, but how can we set ourselves up for success given these facts?
Well, one thing is to have a consistent plan giving program as part of your overall resource development program. It's simply another option. We're not telling people how to use their assets. We're letting them know there are different options to give now, give over time, or make a future gift. And sometimes times like these, particularly with an aging population, because of economic concerns, someone may not feel they can make a large gift today, but if anything is left, they'd like to leave all or part of it to one or more charities. And by building that plan giving pipeline consistently over time, you'll have gifts that are being received during the good times and the bad times. And over time, probably, well, for example, we've I've seen organizations receive a windfall bequest, and then they've gone out and they've created new brick and mortar projects that have overhead without any thought about how they're going to support the new programs that they've built. That's simply not a wise decision. So you need to think strategically, and on some of those very large gifts, particularly if an organization is operating in a capital campaign of some sort, there may well be an endowment component of that campaign that planned gifts could be restricted to. And then within that restriction, if someone has a particular area of interest, they can further restrict that. And they might actually prefer to support that sooner rather than later.
Well, I'll just add, Barlow, that I can picture learning this when I first started out in development, the pie chart of your diverse revenue stream. And that was always drilled into me. You have to have a diverse revenue stream. And I think a lot of the nonprofits who are in, quite honestly, a panic now are those who either solely relied on grants or solely relied on events. And they didn't have that diversity where they had individual giving, they had event revenue, they had a couple grants, they had corporate sponsorships. And so my advice just for not only plan giving professionals, but even those in general development, because we do have some one-person shops where you're not just focusing on plan giving, but you're focused on everything development, is really just that diverse revenue stream, and make sure that in these hard times that your organization won't take a huge hit because you can rely on the alternative revenue to get you through that challenge.
Thanks so much, Julie. Thanks, Barlow. Just to wrap us up here, we talk a lot about alleviating the anxieties of donors and folks who are establishing their estate plans. But what about the plan giving professionals, people working on these development teams? Is there any advice or reassurances that you can offer plan giving departments who are anxious or concerned about the future of their own plan giving programs?
Well, I'll hop in, and Julie, you may have some additional points. The first point, this goes back as a young development officer back in the 70s and 80s. Back then, we were having a rough time in the economy. And unfortunately, the first thing that happens when there are concerns about the economy is they freeze your budget. Then they say, we want to take back part of your budget, 10% or 15%. Then there are additional dictates. No travel. You can't go see donors. Those open positions, you can't fill them. You've got to cut your fundraising marketing channels. Those kinds of things that talk about getting into a death spiral. The advancement office is a revenue center rather than an expense center. So you have to go to battle for your program. I'm reminded about a medical center, the Baskin-Palmer Eye Institute, a gentleman whose eyesight is part of the University of Miami. He traveled from New York to Miami for eye surgery, and it saved his vision. And this fellow was a true madman, Madison Avenue advertising executive. And he was so pleased with the results, he left a restricted bequest, and this is back in it would have been the 70s or 80s, over $1 million to fund the development operation and plan giving program for one department within the medical unit. And it was for the Baskin-Palmer Eye Institute. And he saw that as an investment to plant seeds for the future. So they would always have the resources they needed. That forward thinking, you've got donors, that kind of idea would resonate. You have other people that would simply make a large gift without any restrictions to the university. But going to battle, going to bat, saying that if we spend less, we're going to raise less. I think we need to think strategically instead of just doing the easy way and saying the cuts are going to be evenly absorbed across every department within the organization. Not always an easy conversation or a popular conversation to have with others within the institution, but for the long-term financial stability of the organization, it's important to have those conversations.
I 100% agree with that. It's tough because when the economy's down, the need for your mission is greater. And that's when we're seeing staff cuts, program cuts across the board. In some cases, not. But really, it's the need for your mission is greater. And so sometimes it doesn't make sense. But having that long-term reserve strategy is so important. And one of the ways to achieve that is through continuing your plan giving program. And so, like Barlow said, just really advocating for that and trying to suggest a way to cut other expenses that won't affect your department.
Julie and Barlow, thanks so much for being with us today. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.